Western media is on a mission, not to tell the truth, but to control the narrative. Turn on the news, and you'll hear the same script recycled again and again. Traore is a threat to stability. Burkina Faso is descending into authoritarianism. Military rule must be condemned. But they won't tell you why the people still come to the streets, shouting his name as loud as they can. They won't tell you why, in the eyes of so many young Africans, Traore isn't a tyrant. He's the first one in decades who's actually doing what Africans want. What they call danger, many call deliverance. Because the truth is simple. The West doesn't fear instability, it fears independence. For decades, Burkina Faso was called a so-called democracy. The French had their boots on the ground. Western companies had their hands in the mines. The IMF had its pen in every national budget. And through it all, the people remained poor. The gold kept leaving Africa, but the national debt kept going up. Terrorism kept spreading, but none of that made media headlines. Back then, there were no urgent opinion pieces, no analysts worrying about human rights, no editorials questioning the legitimacy of power. Why? Because the country was playing by the rules, their rules. As long as the foreign contracts were safe and the military bases remained, everything was fine. The suffering, the corruption, the inequality, that was just background noise. But then something shifted. A young captain stepped into the spotlight, refusing to dance to the old tune. He didn't just take power, he took a stand. Against the system, against the silence, against the idea that Africans should wait politely for change, while others profit from their resources. Ibrahim Traoré didn't arrive wrapped in diplomacy. He wasn't groomed in European think tanks. He wasn't brought in through elections funded by America. He came through the ranks, hardened by the failures he saw firsthand. He came with conviction, not a consultant's brief. And the first thing he did, he cut the strings. He told France to pack up its military bases and go. He refused to renew the same contracts that had turned Burkina Faso into a source of wealth for others, but a graveyard for its own children. He nationalized gold mines. He started building a gold refinery at home, so the country wouldn't have to keep sending its resources away for pennies. To some in the West, those are radical moves. To Africans, these moves should have happened decades ago. But the reaction from Western media was swift and predictable. They didn't ask whether these moves were popular. They didn't ask what the people wanted. They went straight to panic mode. They went straight for the propaganda playbook. Suddenly, Traore became a populist firebrand. The country was labeled a hotbed of instability. Headlines warned of Russian influence, jihadist chaos, and the collapse of Western diplomacy in the Sahel. But not once did they ask the most obvious question: why is this happening now? Why are young leaders rising in Africa? Why are countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso turning their backs on their former colonial rulers? Why are they tearing up IMF agreements, building new alliances, and calling for unity across the continent? The answer is clear: because the old system never served Africa. And Traore is simply the first to say it without apology. Think about this. For years, Burkina Faso hosted French soldiers under the pretense of fighting terrorism. And yet, terrorism spread. Attacks increased. Displacement surged. Entire regions were swallowed by conflict. So if the French presence was supposed to bring security, why did the violence get worse? That's a question Western media refuses to ask. Because the truth would be too uncomfortable. Foreign military presence was never just about security. It was about access, control, influence. It was about maintaining a grip on a region long after their colonial flags came down. So when Traore ordered Western troops out, it wasn't chaos, it was clarity. A message to the world that Burkina Faso would no longer be a playground for foreign powers, that its land, its resources, its future would be decided at home. Of course, that kind of message doesn't sit well with the old powers. So they hit back the only way they know how, through the media. Not with facts, but with fear. They painted him as unpredictable, dangerous, erratic. They said he was leaning toward Russia, even though no concrete alliance had been declared. They said he was crushing democracy, even though the people were rallying for him, not against. They ignored the crowds, the music, the flags, the raw pride on the faces of the youth. They ignored the fact that people were finally believing again in something bigger than survival. Something that looked like freedom from the West. And here's the double standard. When Ukraine resists Russian invasion, the West cheers. When African nations resist French control, the West panics. When Eastern Europe throws off Soviet influence, it's called freedom. But when Africa throws off Western dominance, it's called a dangerous trend. That's not journalism. That's colonial logic wearing a new suit. But the people see through it now. In the streets of Ouagadougou, you won't find confusion, you'll find clarity. They know why the headlines are hostile. They know what it means when a leader says no to the IMF, to France, to the UN, to anyone who wants to tell Africans what to do from afar. It means the spell is breaking. The same spell that kept African economies chained to extractive deals. The same spell that said democracy only counts when it delivers profits to Paris or London or America. The same spell that allowed unelected institutions like the IMF to decide how many teachers a government could afford to hire. Traore's defiance is a threat, not because it breeds chaos, but because it inspires a new system. A new kind of system where decisions are made locally for the people, not scripted by big corporations or multinational companies. One where sovereignty isn't a slogan, but a strategy. And that's what scares them most. Because if Burkina Faso succeeds, even slightly, it sets a precedent. It shows that Africa doesn't need to beg, that Africa can nationalize, that Africa can reject the experts, that Africa can stand up and survive. And if one country does it, others will follow. Mali already has. Niger is leaning in, Chad is watching, Senegal is waking up. Zimbabwe is building its own lithium plants. Kenya is protesting IMF austerity in the streets. It's spreading. And it can't be stopped with headlines. This isn't just about one man in a uniform. It's about a continent confronting its past, and refusing to be a slave of the West. Which brings us to the question the media won't ask. If Traore is so dangerous, why are so many people willing to risk their lives to support him? Because that's the part of the story they'll never show you. The part where people march not out of fear but out of hope. Where children wave homemade flags. Where elders say they haven't felt pride like this in 40 years. Where mothers name their sons after the man who finally said enough. And that brings us here, to the moment where the world starts paying attention. Not because the headlines told them to, but because the people won't be ignored. You want to know why they fear Traore? Because he's breaking the formula. He doesn't play the humble student of Western democracy. He doesn't beg for validation. He doesn't wait for applause from Brussels, Paris, or Washington. He acts, he leads, he rewrites the rules without permission. And let's be clear, this isn't new. History is soaked in the blood of leaders who tried the same. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown after dreaming of a United States of Africa. Lumumba was assassinated for refusing to hand Congo's resources to Belgian companies. Sankara was gunned down after 4 years of fearless reform. Every time an African leader tries to cut the puppet strings, the puppeteer pulls harder. So when Traoré shut down the French military bases in Burkina Faso, what did Western media say? Security concerns. Jihadist threat. They called it reckless. But let me ask, why was French military presence there for over a decade, and terrorism still grew? Why did their peacekeeping always seem to coincide with looted gold and military contracts? Maybe, just maybe, the threat wasn't what they said it was. Maybe the real threat was independence. When he stood in front of the crowd and said, "We want our own soldiers on our own land, not foreign occupiers," you could feel the tremor. Not just in Burkina Faso but across Africa. Mali listened. Niger followed. The dominoes began to wobble. And suddenly, media outlets that once ignored West Africa were all paying attention. Not to praise, but to poison. You'll see headlines like, "A dangerous shift toward authoritarianism," or "Russia's growing influence in the Sahel." Not a word about self-determination. Not a sentence about reversing decades of foreign exploitation. They're not reporting the truth. They're defending the empire. And let's talk about that Russian influence talking point, because it's the favorite card in the Western deck. Every time an African country says no to Western dominance, they say, Russia must be behind it. As if Africans can't think for themselves. As if sovereignty must be imported. Wagner or not, the deeper issue is this. African nations are refusing to be proxies in another Cold War. They're rejecting both NATO and Kremlin interference. What they want is not to switch masters, it's to be free. And here's the irony. The same media that cheered the Arab Spring, that lionized Zelensky for resisting Russia, suddenly loses its voice when Africans resist France. Suddenly, revolution becomes instability, independence becomes extremism, the mask slips. That's why the real revolution is happening in the narrative. In how we tell the story of African struggle. In what voices get amplified, and which ones get erased. So hear this. If a nation nationalizes its mines, rejects IMF loans, cancels foreign military deals, builds infrastructure for its people, that's not tyranny. That's what real democracy looks like. Not the version propped up with USAID and surveillance drones. And let's not pretend the IMF is neutral. Since 1980, over 30 African nations have been forced into structural adjustment programs. Schools slashed. Healthcare gutted. Local industries suffocated. All in the name of fiscal discipline. The result, endless debt and dependence. But when Burkina Faso and Zimbabwe say we'll process our own minerals, when Kenya's youth march against foreign-imposed taxes, that's the antidote. That's economic resistance. That's Africa remembering who it is. Don't get it twisted, the people know. Africa sees the strings of the West. You'll find graffiti on Nairobi walls saying IMF out. TikToks from Niger mocking French withdrawal. A generation that doesn't fear the word revolution, they post it. They live it. This generation. They're shaking the tree. Traore's words hit different because they're not wrapped in diplomat speak. He doesn't promise peace and then sign weapons deals behind closed doors. He speaks like someone who's walked the same dusty roads, faced the same hunger, fought the same battles. That scares the elite more than any gun. And here's a question for every so-called analyst. Why don't you ever ask what the people want? Not the presidents, not the IMF officials, not the foreign investors. The miners. The farmers, the students. Ask them what democracy looks like. Ask them why they keep marching for leaders like Traore, because they're not marching for chaos, they're marching for control. Over their future, their land, their voice. They want what any people want. To live with dignity, to see their gold-paved local roads, not Parisian boulevards. To see their lithium-power African schools, not German car factories. To see their soldiers defend their soil, not enforce foreign agendas. That's the fight, and that's why they're trying to silence it. But the truth is too loud now. Too many eyes are open, too many cameras are rolling, too many voices refuse to be quiet. So let me leave you with this. If sovereignty is a threat to Western powers, what does that say about their definition of peace? If rejecting the IMF, the World Bank and foreign troops makes you a villain, what kind of hero were they trying to create? And if the media is so desperate to paint every act of African independence as chaos, maybe, just maybe, it's because they know the empire is falling. You tell me, is Traore the danger, or is he the cure? If you agree with our message, subscribe to our channel, share this video, like it, spread the message. And if you're tired of lies dressed up as freedom, drop your country's flag in the comments. Let's show the imperialists that Africans are taking back control.